February 21, 2014, Viktor Yanukovych left his residence in Kiev. Together with 21 security guards, the compromised president flew to Kharkov by helicopter. From there, already by car, he reached the Crimea, then by sea reached the shores of Russian Federation. According to the video surveillance system installed in the residence of President Yanukovych, the gathering and removal of valuables began on February 19th. The flight was well planned and quietly done. However, these details were clarified much later, and on the morning of February 22, 2014, the president of Ukraine simply disappeared. On the same day, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine adopted a resolution on depriving the president of Ukraine the right to execute his constitutional powers. The presidential elections were scheduled for May 25th of that year. 328 members of parliament voted in favor of this decision.
Рішення прийнято!
This is the 7th series of the film about the ATO, History of the War. We're trying to understand the course of the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine, its causes and effects. What does the Russian Federation have to do with all this? And why does the conflict between Ukraine and Russia pose a threat to Europe? On May 25th, Ukraine held snap presidential elections. Approximately 35 million people have the right to vote in Ukraine. More than 5 million people were unable to show up to vote due to the annexation of Crimea and the seizure of cities by separatists in the eastern regions of the country. But even under these circumstances, voter turnout was very high. Approximately 18 million people visited polling stations, which is about 60% of the total, including voters in Crimea and the Donbass. The final vote count lasted for several days. However, the next day it became clear that the second round of elections would not be necessary. Over 54% of voters supported the candidacy of Petro Poroshenko. According to Ukrainian legislation, if one of the candidates receives more than 50% of the vote, his victory is announced after the first round. A few days later, Ukraine had a new president and commander-in-chief, and the very next day after the elections, the battle for control of the Donetsk airport began. Let's look back again. In summer 2012, Ukraine and Poland jointly held the European Football Championship. It was a spectacular event in the life of the country, and not only in the sporting sense. This was another, small but difficult for Ukraine step toward Europe, an attempt to get closer to Western civilization. In the process of preparing for the championship, the country had changed. The main roads were repaired and the infrastructure was prepared. The sport competition gave an impetus to the development of the transport network and destroying established stereotypes and presented Ukraine to tourists from abroad in a completely different light. It was not a fragment of the USSR with the dark stain of Chernobyl, but a beautiful, modern and interesting country for the average traveler. Not only were stadiums built or renovated for Euro 2012, high-speed trains were launched. They connected the main megacities, allowing to get from Kiev to Lviv or Donetsk in 5 hours instead of 12. Airports and hotels were reconstructed, and public transport was upgraded. The tournament went down in history as the first championship of the old world that was held on the territory of Central and Eastern Europe. The slogan Euro 2012, "We're creating history together," became quite prophetic. Then, in the midst of the championship at the Donetsk airport, European football fans rushed to get on a plane. They had fun and waved flags of their favorite teams. But on the night of May 26, 2014, several trucks with armed terrorists came in to seize control of the Donetsk airport. From the very beginning of the ATO in Donbass, airports, military slips, and other strategic facilities were guarded by special forces of Ukraine. However, unlike many other objects, the airport of Donetsk continued to function, and the terminal building was not changed for defense. In order not to frighten the passengers, the forces of the 3rd Regiment of the Special Forces of Ukraine, whose task was to guard the airport, were located in the next building, the old terminal. On May 26th at 7:10 a.m., the last civilian flight departed from the Donetsk airport. And on the eve, about 3 o'clock in the morning, militants on several trucks drove up to the new terminal of the airport. In addition to aero weapons, they brought with them grenade launchers, Shmel rocket launchers, and portable anti-craft missile systems. The SBU officer and trader Alexander Holovura led the militants inside the terminal. All these preparations were noticed by the guards, but there was no order given from the high command to open fire. The commanders did not want to risk the lives of civilians and the staff, who could have easily been caught in a crossfire inside the building. Later, the counterintelligence service of the Security Service of Ukraine conducted a special operation, and Holovura was detained in Donetsk. And thanks to this, certain circumstances of the storming of the airport were revealed. To determine the strength and staff of the assault groups, 45 militants of the sabotage group Iskra participated in the siege of the airport. They acted under the command of the Russian officer Sisenko. The majority of the fighters of this group was comprised of citizens of the Russian Federation and had military combat experience in various hotspots throughout the world. The so-called Kadyrov Special Forces, 26 mercenaries from the Ramzan Kadyrov gang, and about 120 mercenaries of the Brigade Vostok also participated in the attack under the command of Alexander Hodakovsky. The last was the commander of the Alpha Division of the Security Service of Ukraine in Donetsk. Another 30 people were representatives of the pro-Russian movement Oplot. The operation was led by Major General of the Federal Security Service of Russia Alexander Borodai. The operation allowed for the siege of the airport, meteors, control tower, and adjoining buildings. This would allow the use of the airstrip for the transfer of reinforcements from Russia. The Russian command counted on the fact that Ukrainian security officers wouldn't open fire in the complex. The aim of the operation was to demonstrate the strength, seizure, and disarmament of the Ukrainian military. For the purpose of propaganda, journalists of the Russian mass media were sent into the airfield area. Having provided a threefold numerical superiority over the defenders of the object, the Russians hoped for an overwhelming victory. However, the Ukrainians put up a fight to the point that May 26th became one of the turning points of the war. In the morning, then acting President Alexander Turchinov put an ultimatum to the terrorists to release the airport, and for the transfer to this area, special forces and paratroopers reserves were prepared. Air support was also provided in the structure of several Mi-24 combat helicopters and Su-25 fighter jets. A group of special forces at the airport received a combat mission to ensure the safe landing of reinforcements. In the morning, the airport was closed and all passengers and local personnel were escorted out. The Ukrainian aircraft appeared over the airport. Reinforcements arrived in several Mi-8 transport helicopters. This reserve was grouped from the men of the 140th Special Operations Center of Ukraine, the 10th Detachment of the Main Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense, the Special Guard of the National Guard of Ukraine Jaguar, and the paratroopers of the 95th Brigade. When the helicopters came in for landing, militants on the roof of the terminal deployed portable anti-aircraft missile systems. However, the specificity of shooting was such that the shooter had to accompany the target for a few seconds, waiting for it to be captured by the gun's homing head. These seconds became decisive because, having the order to ensure the landing of reinforcements, the snipers of the 3rd Regiment of the Ukrainian Special Forces opened the fire. So that was when the first shot sounded on the territory of the Donetsk airport. The saboteur operator was killed. A fierce battle at short distances started. Contrary to all that went down, the reinforced helicopters successfully landed, and the reserve forces reached the old airport terminal building without any losses of life. Then the stormtroopers made the next offensive on the roof of the new airport terminal. Here there was a very characteristic episode for this hybrid war. After several hours of fighting, a member of parliament representing the militants arrived. He asked permission to evacuate the wounded from the new terminal of the airport. Soon an ambulance arrived. Nevertheless, instead of doctors, militants dressed in camouflage jumped out of the ambulance and began unloading cases of ammunition. This is not the first and not the last time when militants used civil transport, disguising themselves as doctors or journalists. War is a path of deceit, says the ancient treatise of Sun Tzu. The misuse of the ambulance led to its immediate destruction. During the battle, the sabotage squad, Iskra, suffered the most losses and its commander, Colonel FSB Boris Sasenko, perished. Also, Kadyrov's special forces were defeated. Some of the rebels retreated from the airport. At the same time, at least 2 trucks were destroyed as a result of the chaotic actions of the disoriented terrorists who decided that the city was being stormed by Ukrainian troops. The saboteurs wounded at the airport, who did not take the opportunity to leave it in the ambulance, were killed in those vehicles under the fire of the militants. Throughout the entire following night, from May 26th to May 27th, gunfights continued in Donetsk. The militants and representatives of the local criminals fought against each other. In these skirmishes, civilians also died. Several vehicles were shot. It is interesting that at that time the so-called leader of the DPR, Denis Pushilin, simply disappeared. The fighting lasted all day and ended only in the evening of May 27th. The assault team of the Ukrainian Special Forces entered the new terminal and occupied it. The weapons left by the invaders were gathered. As a trophy, a large number of grenade launchers, jet flamethrowers, anti-aircraft complexes, and even mortar were seized. On May 28th, Ukrainian Special Forces received an assignment to mop up the airport's territory and to look for direct evidence of Russia's attack. The cleanup crew managed to find several bodies of soldiers dressed in uniforms and bearing gear of Russian production. The date of production of bulletproof vests and other gear was March to April 2014. Several indicative weapons were also found. After checking the serial numbers, it was learned that earlier these weapons were at the disposal of the battalion of the Ukrainian Marine Corps in Feodosia, and they were taken captive by the Russian forces during the annexation of Crimea. On May 29th, a Ukrainian transport helicopter Mi-8 with 12 officers led by General of the National Guard Serhiy Kulchitsky was shot down near Slavyansk. Everyone on board the helicopter perished. As it turned out later, for the liquidation of the Major General, the terrorists announced an award of $4 million, but the militants did not receive the promised money, and after some time they were eliminated. After the defeat at the airport, a disagreement arose among the separatist leaders in Donetsk. On May 29th, probably waiting for the entry of Ukrainian troops into the city, the DPR fighters plundered a huge hypermarket that was located not far from the airport. All goods, including large household appliances, were stolen. The looting lasted for several days, and as a result, all the products were taken out of largest supermarket in the city. However, Ukrainian troops did not enter Donetsk, as the army did not actually have forces to support such an assault operation. That same reserve of special forces, which landed to help the defenders of the airport, was practically all that the Ukrainian military command actually had at its disposal at that time. As a result of the successful actions of the Ukrainian special forces, more than 50 Russian saboteurs were killed at the Donetsk airport. The price of victory for the Ukrainian side was one wounded soldier. Russian and foreign journalists, specially called to Donetsk instead of reporting on the siege of the airport, received hot shots. Photos and videos of the dead bodies of militant separatists in the morgues of Donetsk were demonstrated all over the world. The leaders of the so-called DPR didn't find a way to conceal the huge losses of lives of Russian citizens in this battle. The Prime Minister of the DPR and Major General of the Russian Federal Security Service Alexander Borodai officially recognized the death of 34 Russians. As such, the myth about the invincibility of Russian special forces and the lack of professionals in the Ukrainian army was dispelled. The masks were unveiled. It was in the fight for the Donetsk airport when the myth of the so-called popular uprising, the civil character of the confrontation in the east of Ukraine, was completely debunked. Trying to curry favor with Russian curators, separatist leaders organized the transportation of bodies of the dead Russians to their homeland. The inscription on the truck, Cargo 200, is a military code mark about the transportation of the dead. On May 30th, accompanied by journalists, the first vehicle with a sorrowful load passed through the border and left for Rostov. Prokofiev Airport in Donetsk for a long time was one of the hottest spots in the east of Ukraine. In total, his defense lasted 242 days. As a result of fierce fighting, the airport was completely destroyed. For their high resistance in battle, the defenders of the airport, the militants themselves, nicknamed cyborgs, right in the midst of the battle.